Hey guys, Art Decline here, Average Picker. So I do plan to leave this channel as focused on locks and lock picking as possible, but I think we're going to take a little bit of a deviation for a moment here. So if you just want to see lock stuff, you can stop watching now. We're not going to look at anything lock-wise. What we're going to take a look at, though, is this, and this is a Veronica FM transmitter. I spent a number of years doing micro broadcasting, also known as pirate radio. And so that's what we're going to take a look at briefly here. So for me, breaking into micro broadcasting was kind of my first foray into the die kind of stuff and the do-it-yourself. And for me, it blew the lid off of everything. And I think in some abstract way, this connection is also what got me interested in locks. It's just this idea of things being off limits and, when it's actually fairly accessible. Now, of course, at the time when I got into this, it was probably fairly similar with lockpicking because the web wasn't really there and wasn't formed like it is now. And the information wasn't getting passed around. And so you really had to know somebody who was kind of into this stuff, or you'd pick up these little zines, these like little Xerox magazines that people wrote zines about everything, but there were some that floated around about pirate radio, and there was others that went around about lock picking. And they were kind of good. They were sort of barely enough to get you started. But for me, anyway, when we got this up and running, it blew the world wide open. I'd grown up, with stations being like, 10,000 watts of rocking power. And it felt very inaccessible and something that, you couldn't do or, really get into it unless you studied it, went into the industry and ended up working for one of these large radio stations. And so this just kind of shattered that whole world for me. And it brought everything in. It made everything feel very accessible, and it made everything feel like, you can get out there and do it yourself. So our station was called freq13. We ran pretty much every night from roughly 11 or midnight until 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning. We had the whole left side of the dial free. So we were locked in pretty far down. I think we were around 88, 88.4 maybe. It's about where we operated. Typically, it may have been 88.7. Some days it did change. So this was the transmitter. It's a Veronica 1 watt, and I ran this transmitter in this configuration for several years, every single night from midnight until about 6 a.m. We were pretty lucky. We had pretty much the whole left side of the dial fairly free, and we were locked in pretty well on our frequency, so we didn't have a whole lot of leakage, which is really good for not getting detected. And you can kind of see there's not a whole lot to getting onto FM. It's kind of interesting because, and again, I guess to tie it into locks, a lot of the technology has not changed all that much as far as the basics of what you need to get on. The tech has changed. I'm not trying to say that, but you can pick up a book, from like the 50s or 60s on FM broadcasting, and it's still relevant as far as how frequency works and the power and the wattage and all that stuff. Our antenna was mounted about 40 feet in the air. Actually, it was probably higher than that. But 40 feet is kind of the magic number. And the first antenna I had was pretty much made out of bent coat hangers, PVC pipe, an SO239. You have to have that to make the connection. And then we had, 150 feet of coax maybe that ran down the tree, snaked across the yard, and went up into the window, and we were broadcasting from the bedroom of the apartment, which is, I will say, a really bad way to do that. You really do not want to be broadcasting from your bedroom, but we were. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing of everything that's going on. I will point out that this was kind of a regret. So these 3 dials here, this is actually how you tune the unit. And in hindsight, I wish I had done dip switches. It would have been a lot easier to lock on to a frequency and keep it locked on and not drift as much. But these components are a little bit easier to do, and you basically, to do your tuning, you just come in and that little part rotates. And so I think, if I remember correctly, this is your main tuner, and these two kind of do your fine tuning. I may have that reversed. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So this kind of gets you in, and this fine tunes that. I will say also, in our bad practices, we did all our testing live. We should have used a dummy load. That's really the way you want to do it. We did everything live. So we would switch on a radio, and when we had to lock in again, if it drifted too much. And honestly, we would just start live broadcasting across the spectrum until we got it dialed back into where we had been. Again, really wrong way to do that. You want to get dummy loads and things like that and test it kind of on the quiet. This being 1 watt of power, yeah, it's restricted. So. And the back of the unit is pretty simple. You've just got your RCA left and right channels in. This is nothing. This is just a screw that's helping to hold some of the assembly together. And that's your coax cable, or your output. So this would run out to your antenna. So in this case, we used a small 2-channel mixing board. I actually still have it. That's all it was. And we had pretty much a permanent mic set up on one side, and the other side we would use for everything from the audio from VHS players to record players, MP3 players, CDs, and pretty much whatever. And we would just, crossfade across. Pick this up for like $30-$40 at a pawn shop. I'm not even sure if I paid that actually. But you just run your output from there to your input on the transmitter, and then this went out to your antenna. And that's really all there was to it. The 1 watt of power, like I said, 40 feet was the magic number. If you could get your antenna up past 40 feet, you were pretty golden. 1 watt of power, we had an easy 1 mile radius on a really good day. And by that I mean we maybe only had a couple of those a year. We could actually, depending on which way you drove, get up to 5 miles off of just 1 watt of power. So we were running less power than like a Christmas light. We used to joke about that all the time. And potentially get something that you could hear, I'm using that term loosely, up to 5 miles away in some cases. So after some years, though, we decided we needed to up our game. And so we installed this unit, and this is just an amp. This runs about, I forget what it is. It's 3 to 15 watts of power, I think, is what it amps. And again, it relies on using one of those, or 2 of those actually, I guess, to dial in that power and the frequencies and everything. And it was, again, kind of a bad choice. There's easier ways to do it than trying to tune these in. It's labeled 10. It goes up to 15. Yeah, we never actually could get this to work that well. We had a lot of problems and struggled with it, and it was really hard to tell when it was fully working and when it wasn't. No real explanation for why, I don't know. Could just be some bad solder or a bad repair job on our part. It could just be that we had some kind of power leakage occurring somewhere and we didn't realize it, because we did have some connectors outside that we had attempted to waterproof, but we could have just been losing something there. But it was pretty easy. Again, one of these just connects to the transmitter and your other one connects to your antenna. So this sits in between the transmitter and your antenna. So I had to do a few reshoots, but anyway, yeah, just to kind of wrap this whole thing up, we ran this for several years, and really our primary rule was nothing that's normally played on the radio, and we just kind of let it travel by word of mouth and people discovering it, so it went very slowly. But we did end up with quite a listener base, and our coverage actually covered the university there, and they didn't have a radio station. We kind of became the unofficial university radio station in an odd way. And towards the And it started to get a lot more community oriented, which kind of put a resurgence of energy back into us for doing it. And we were bringing in like local bands, and they were able to play in our kitchen. And then we were piping it out, and so we could actually record them because we had a lot of recording equipment. So we could record them in the kitchen, but pipe out that whole kind of practice recording session, or whatever you want to call it, as well, live. And that got to be pretty neat because at that point it started to really feel like it was including everybody in it. We had this sort of vision too that what we would, if we could get enough people into it and committed, that we could basically dot the whole area with a whole bunch of micro broadcasters, and we'd all be on the same frequency, and we would just be essentially repeaters, and we would share kind of time slots. So, we might run midnight to 3 a.m., and then we would plug our radio in, and we would broadcast out the guy who was playing from 3:01 to maybe 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. And bounce each other's signals to get a whole lot more coverage. So that way we didn't need more wattage. We just needed a lot of little tiny stations, all sharing the same frequency and just running at different time slots and being willing to bounce each other around. That unfortunately never took off. We had a lot of interest, but when it came down to the actual commitment and building these stations, not a whole lot. But there you go, guys. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. A little bit of a deviation, I know. Well, quite a deviation from LOX. If you want to know more about it, leave some comments. I'm happy to do another video or something. This was a very non-technical look at this. I could go into more detail if you wanted to, but like I said, I do want to keep this mostly focused on LOX, and I don't know what kind of interest there is in things like this. But I'm willing to do a few more videos to answer any questions or whatever, or just shoot me an email and frequency13 at gmail.com, and I'll answer you back over email or do another video. All right, guys, you have a good one.